Greetings, Internet, I am Ken from the Computer Clan, and today, we're going to talk about these. Jim Reekes recently commented about Apple removing the startup sound, and for those who don't know, he's the guy that made the iconic sound that we all know and love today. But since it started getting removed, he was like, well, it's kind of like when you go to a restaurant and when you have a seat, there's no one there to greet you. It's kind of strange. So today, we're going to be talking about the history of the startup sounds on the Mac. So before the Macintoshes had startup sounds, the original startup beep was actually introduced with the Apple II, and it was kind of like a newborn's first cry. It's like, hey, the system made it, it's safe, and it made a little beep sound. So Apple took that and put it in the Mac when they started developing that. So Charlie Kellner worked with Andy Hertzfeld in the early days of Apple to develop the original Macintosh startup sound. It was kind of like a little bell sound, and the original Macintosh featured an 8-bit 22 kilohertz speaker, so the capabilities were limited, but I think the chime still worked out. So the next startup sound was developed by Mark, however you want to pronounce his last name, I'm sorry man, Mark L, we'll just call him. So this was the Tritone type sound effect, and it debuted with the Macintosh II. So a few years after that, that's where we see Jim Reekes enter the picture. Now, one of the funny things is when System 7 was being developed, he was developing sound effects for the system beeps. And there was a xylophone sound effect that sounded like this. A lot of us probably recognize that. It was called Let It Beep, kind of as a joke because, you know, it was the Beatles and Apple with Apple Corps and Apple Computer having legal disputes. To get a name down, Jim had to choose something that would be okay with the legal team. So he was originally joking, saying, hey, let's call the beep sound Let It Beep, to parody Let It Be by the Beatles. And people were like, there's no way any legal team is going to let you do that because Apple Corps has rights to certain names. So he said, So Sue Me. And that's where the name actually came from. So Sue Me was actually a homonym for So Sue Me, which is spelt differently. And that's actually the final name of the xylophone sound effect. And it has lasted till this day. So Jim didn't just work on the system beeps, he worked on the startup sounds. So he was like, we have better speakers, and when you hear the sound, it's typically because you had to reboot the computer after a crash. Well, he didn't want people rebooting the computer after a crash and hearing a crappy sound. He wanted kind of like a palate cleanser sound effect. So he thought, let's make something a little bit nicer. He used a Korg synthesizer, and he played a C major chord. And that startup sound debuted with the Quadra 700 in 1991. So let's fast forward a couple years to 1993 with the release of the Quadra 840 AV. This featured another startup sound by Jim, which is very, very similar to the one we all know and love today. So this was the original version of that. And then, as time went on, Apple kind of kept changing the startup sound with every different ROM in the system, and Jim was like, well, we're like changing the brand. We need to be more consistent with our ear cons, if you will. In fact, one of these different startup sounds was recorded for the original Power Macintosh 6100. Stanley Jordan was a jazz guitarist, and he used a 12-string Yamaha guitar to record this startup sound. Eventually, the company moved back to that Bong-like sound effect for the startup sound, and when Steve Jobs came back to the company, he liked the idea of sticking with that sound. A slightly modified version of that sound was released in 1997, and in fact, that's the one that we're familiar with today as the iconic Mac startup sound. It lasted for 19 years. In 2016, Apple started phasing out the startup sound, unfortunately, so now when you turn on a newer Mac, you don't hear anything. Now what's even more disappointing is that there's a lot of people on the internet claiming that you can just simply re-enable the startup sound with a terminal command. This seemed a little too good to be true because why would Apple just quietly pack a startup sound into a ROM for no reason? So it seems like a lot of people found this information as quote-unquote useful and they shared it with others without actually testing it. The result, a lot of disappointed people. Feel free to try the command for yourself if you have a newer machine, unlike me, and let me know if it actually works, but I wouldn't hold my breath. So there you have it, guys, a brief history of the Mac startup sounds. Let me know what your favorite startup sound is. I'm curious to hear what you have to say, and thank you to Jim for creating this iconic sound we all know and love today. And also, special thanks to my friend Will. He's a great Computer Clan contributor who helped me actually crank out this video really freaking fast. He came up with some of... Hey, get behind the camera! Yeah, you stay over there. Sorry about that. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you in the not-too-distant future. Want to hear something funny?
Yeah.
Alright, so the crash sound on here is like actually like a literal car crash. Wait for it. And, you know, Mark, however you want to pronounce his last name, I'm sorry, man. All right, Lentzer, I have no idea how to pronounce this guy's last name. Lentzer. In fact, one of these different ROMs featured a sound that was recorded by, I forgot his name. Stanley Jordan, that's right. Okay, let me try that again.